Right, so welcome to Digital JavaEE 7, new and noteworthy. And my name is Peter Pilgrim. You probably know me because I used to run a user group in London many years ago. So I'm going to talk to you about JavaEE 7 and all things digital. The agenda today is going to be what digital is. I don't know if you work in the creative software domain. What's area? Since we've got such a small group, what industries are you working in? Anyone want to say? Finance?
E-commerce.
Commerce?
Finance.
Games?
Yeah, I work in gaming, like bingo slots.
Okay. Anything else? Science? Retail? Okay, we've got some in banking. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about JavaEE and essentially what's new and noteworthy. So my slides are Creative Commons. I'm going to put everything up on SlideShare. And about me, well, I mentioned I started a user group many years ago, and I'm a Java champion. I've been programming Java since 1998 or maybe 7, and had a long history of C and C++ before that. Graduated way back in the 90s, and so I have an interest in Scala as well. Digital adoption. So what is digital adoption really? So you've heard of this newfangled word. Really it's a lot to do about how we are changing things in the world and how we're looking at things, but a new perspective. So digital is all about being fast, it's been about agile, it's heavily emphasized on testing, having lots of user experience on your website, and whatever you do. People who work in digital tend to be extremely lean. They care about what their customer sees on their website, and that takes precedence over stakeholders even. So whatever happens on websites through UX testing tends to come back and bite both the developers, operations, and also the stakeholders, because they're thinking of things differently to how they thought they were. So there's a big emphasis on testing. And of course, digital is all about websites, mostly. It can also be about rich client platform applications if you work in the gaming world with native applications, and even back on applications that run on Java Web Start things like, and even Spring things. Digital is about how we are transforming, how we do work, how everybody works on the planet, especially in the UK. I've worked at gov.uk last year, and if you work for the government, you'll realise that a lot of their products have to do with paper-based and form systems. So if you want to register for a new passport, you used to have to go to your post office, and you still do, and now everything will be taken through online. So if you want to do electoral voting, where you get the paper-based cards that are sent to you through the post office, now you can go to a site on the gov.uk and find the equivalent online means of, and that's all about transformation. There are many ways that people are transforming their businesses are transforming offline activities onto online activities, and it's all about how we are thinking about how we do these things. So it's not just a technological aspect, there's also the whole stream of business has to change, and how businesses operate, how they start to transform from the physical onto the online. Of course, people want to be are more online these days than they were 10 years ago. And there's all sorts of questions now about the digital divide, and if you've got grandparents, how do they get online? How do we build websites that are still inclusive to everybody, that gov.uk or anybody else wants to get involved in? And hence, this whole movement called digital adaptation, which is really coming from the website building world into our world, which is JavaEE and enterprise computing. So is Java still relevant for digital, and is Java Enterprise Edition still relevant? And there are lots of detractors out there that still think of J2EE, and I realise that I'm preaching to the converted here, because as a GlassFish user group, you already know that JavaEE is still relevant for your businesses. And I am very much in agreement that JavaEE is still a platform where you can do this fast-paced digital work. And so JavaEE is based on Java, and you have transactions, concurrency, you have all these great things that GlassFish and Wildfly and other platforms like WebLogic and WebThread will give you, like transactions and concurrency, and this whole debate of whether software it should be written in Spring or not Spring, is it heavyweight or lightweight? All these kind of old arguments from 5 years ago are still lurking around, and sometimes even irrelevant. So, and the underlying basis here is that we still have a nice platform that solves a lot of our problems. So we already have remote endpoints. If you think about that, most people are struggling to put together Spring applications with all of the bundling of the technologies and getting it all working together. But if you use something like GlassFish or Payara, you already have these things. So JavaEE, if you don't know it by now, this is what I call the great sandwich. So what we are trying to do in the JavaEE world is put meat, beef or lamb or whatever you're eating, or vegetarian corn in the middle of our sandwich. So on one side of the bun we have clients. And notice over here we got wearables coming. And underneath here we have our infrastructure. And JavaEE is helping us to build applications that build on a standard bundling of Java APIs, the transactions, the performance, the persistence, and the remoting that I showed you in the previous slide. And these are all the technologies in the full platform. So you have things like really great things like bean validation. You have Enterprise Java Beans, and the 5 new things in JavaEE 7 are JSON-P, WebSocket, concurrency utilities, interceptors, and batch. And most of the time, you'll probably be using concurrency utilities. You may use WebSockets. And the reason why you might want to do that is because you want to take advantage of reactive programming, because those APIs support non-blocking I/O. So the main features in JavaEE that for a beginner, I don't know if we have any beginners here, these are things that are worth learning for JavaEE 7, and then you have like a core knowledge going forward on the platform. I highlight CDI because that is the technology to inject beans into other beans and gives you the basis of where the other technologies will be integrated together. They're not quite integrated together yet. If you've been working in J2EE, the new way is to work with WAR files. I say it's the WAR is king or queen. WAR files are the preferred way to do a lot of deployments. I am working at a hedge fund, and they do use air files. And that's the way they are, and that's a choice. And I've seen applications in the past which use air files and a lot of WAR files and libraries, but for I think we're getting away from that technology, especially if we're thinking of microservices where we have separate services and servers all over for clustering and load balancing and scalability. Yeah, so raw files, are, yes, they are very rare, and persistent archives are even rarer still. Containerless is where I see a lot of change in the new digital space, where people like to use things like Docker, Chef or Puppet to actually provision servers on the fly. And you can do that with GlassFish or any type of server. If you think about it, what you want to do is basically you want to execute Java minus jar and the class you want to execute. And that main class will instantiate either GlassFish, Payara, and GlassFish have an embedded API where you can actually deploy a WAR file or WAR files, and there's a whole API. Unfortunately, it's not standard in JavaEE. I wish it was, but there are ways, there are people already thinking, wouldn't it be nice to do this for all application servers? Yes, I mentioned Code Drop Wizard here, and that's an interesting way to code, to really get up a server with metrics built in. Unfortunately, the Code Drop Wizard is based on JavaEE 6. It's stuck with a version of Jersey, and because it's stuck with that version of Jersey, it misses out on the asynchronous, well, it has asynchronicity, but it doesn't have the non-blocking I/O functionality, which you actually do need for reactive applications. Yes, I've already mentioned that. Yes, you. And JavaEE now is testable. There's Archelion, really helps with integration testing that allows you to instantiate your EJBs in a unit test. It brings up a server or connects to a managed server, so you can use it embedded if you want. And then JavaEE also has an embedded container which you can start up for testing. So the things that agile and digital developers want to do, they actually want to test the code as well as run cucumber tests on the code outside, right? Box text, black box testing, and also white box testing. You can do this. So JavaEE 7, the big thing about Servlet 3.1 is that it has non-blocking I/O, so you can get to that reactive world. JAX-RS 2 has async support. WebSocket is asynchronous, it's fully duplex, so you already have that by default. And JMS 2, if you find the product, if you use it outside of the EE platform, and then you may want to invoke asynchronous and non-blocking communications to fire messages. You can do that as well. So I've written a book which covers this a lot in detail called the JavaEE 7, the Developer Handbook. So I won't spare you the details. If you want more to know about JavaEE 7, that's my book. It was published in 2013 last year. And I'm writing a second book called the Digital JavaEE 7, which focus more on web and this way of digital, and hopefully we'll finish that in the middle of spring. So I'm cracking a whip on myself. Okay, Digital JavaEE. So that face is relevant because I'm going to talk a lot about Java Server Faces, and which is a component-orientated framework. For those of you who remember the discussions about 12 years ago, why JSF came out and people described it as this term. And this is because JSF was initially started as Project Rave, and it was based on components, which you can have, and people were already used to things like Swing, like drop buttons and stuff, drop menus and buttons and panels. And JSF tried to take over that world, bring that world of Swing like a forerunner to GWT and bring it into a web world. But the big thing that happened after JSF came out was CDI. CDI is the answer to Spring's dependency injection container and web beans. So I guess I am preaching to the converted here, where you've got these live contextual scopes with different lifetimes. So you've got the request scope, session scope, application scope, and some brand new things if you've not used JSF, called the view scope, conversation scope, and flow scope. And these are particular scopes to do with faces. So view scope is a really interesting scope which allows you to, where you have a bean, and if JSF has a life cycle, but that form bean survives until you move off to another page view. So think of my gov.uk, and I know they haven't done it in Java, but anyway, where you enter your change of address, and you enter your address wrong, you get the wrong age or whatever you do, and you hit the return button, and then, oh, you've missed out the first address line. So what happens in view scope is that scope still survives, your form is still livable, it's still living, but what happens with JSF, it retains that your form being in the lifetime of that view scope, and it adds the validation error messages. And that helps when you are submitting code to a website so that the user's messages don't disappear, and it also helps the developer to interrogate that form bean. Now, what happens if you were to press the button and in your code navigate to a different page, then your form bean would disappear, and the view scope would just end, and then you'll wonder why has JSF treated me just like that? That's what view scope, why it's called view scope. It's retaining the page view. Very useful feature. Yes, so things like login pages and very small data entry for journeys. So journey is a term from digital. It's called the customer journey. It comes from UX. What's the customer journey? In many applications, if you work with user experience people, they will come back, this is the customer's user journey, or they even say, this is all wrong, we have to do it all again. And the blame comes back to us developers to rewrite the whole customer journey, translate that back into Java or JSF. But probably getting away from myself. Oh yes, my first tip is to learn CDI. I've already said so. You use CDI for a lot of your code assembly. Unfortunately, you still need EJB for things like singleton or things that you want to start up. Say like reference catches. When the application starts, you need something like country data or price data, and therefore you need a singleton to be a stateless session EJB or a singleton to be running at deployment time. And CDI doesn't give you that, but CDI gives you some other benefits such as events and interceptors. So this is what the view scope looks like. And I have something called a contact detail controller. At named is the noose annotation. So if you don't use at manage beam because that's deprecated. At view scoped is from the faces packages, JSF faces packages, and basically you can inject your service, which are basically POJOs actually. So that's all it is really, a simple view scope beam. Just annotate your POJO controller like this. I won't go into heavy detail here with code. In JavaEE 6 and in 7, there's something called conversational scope. Remember I was talking just a moment again about the customer journey. Then suppose you have a workflow or kind of a wizard. Conversational scope is much better than view scope because the lifetime of your form beams or your object graph, which is mapped inside the form beam or property of a form beam, survives. So a conversation can either be transient, it doesn't exist at all, or it's persistent, which means it does exist. The developer controls the life cycle. And of course, your conversation scope beam controller has to be serializable, and the reason why is because the servlet session supports pacification. Without it, clustering would be impossible. Your session couldn't move around, so your actual conversation scope beam has to be serializable. And it solves a long-standing problem with the Java servlet technology when it was created a dozen years ago. There were only two scopes. You can request scope and session scope, and most people would pollute the session scope, and various tricks were done to try and have a conversation to store data, and what would happen is your session would be polluted with all these objects. So conversation scope solves this long-standing problem. So again, you have an annotation at conversation scope, and you annotate the class, you make sure it implements serializable, and if you inject in a conversation object, this conversation object is, you treat that as opaque data, and you can inject other POJOs into your application controller. And you call conversation begin. The life cycle is pretty easy to move the conversation from transient to long running, and then conversation end to end that conversation. So if you think of a complex digital application, a web page of data entry where you're going through multiple pages, perhaps 10 pages, in, say, a business application like a caseworker system for the prison service where you're trying to enter somebody's case details, that allows you, conversation scope allows you to retain that information. And you can then also persist your data. So it comes into your database if you happen to use a stateful session EJB. And that's really handy to know. If you use a stateful session EJB and a conversation, then and you have a persistence of extended then you can actually save data. And so you have a couple of methods here. In a wizard, you want to check, and when at the start, that you have actually a conversation. So you say, do I have a conversation, or is this conversation, or I don't? If I don't, start the conversation. And if you check at the end, if I have a long-running conversation, then I can end it. And this is quite useful if you're going to get more sophisticated. If you have a 100-page form, you might want to say, well, it's not enough time to actually enter that data in one session. So maybe with a conversation state, I can allow the user to save that information into a database somewhere and add a column not quite complete or something like that. So you can do some very useful things with conversation scope. But as soon as the user, you get to a point in the form where you want to end the conversation, either through cancel or confirm, then you must remember to call conversation end to end the flow. Flow scope is definitely new in JavaEE 7 JSF 2.2, and I call it the underrated star of the actual release, a JSF release. And again, it's a life cycle that sits between the request and the session scope. And what's brilliant about the flow scope is that you not only have this conversation, but it's actually implicit. And what that means is that you can have faceless flows, as we call them, and they're actually protected. A faceless flow has one single entry point. It's actually defined by the file layout in your application, but it can have many exit points. So, and you can have another kind of XML deployment file that defines your flow scope, or it can be implicit. You can, again, have like beans.xml, just make it blank, and then it's implicit. So once you have a flow scope, guess what you have as flow scope bean? And that constitutes your faceless flow. One fantastic thing about faceless flows is that they can invoke another flow. And if you think of the possibilities, what that means, you've got a way of modularizing your applications for the very first time. You can pass parameters from one flow to the other, name parameters. And you can also pass back out of the nested flow outbound parameters. So if you think of stored procedures, the way you use JDBC or stored procedures, you've got in parameters and you've got out parameters. You don't actually have a return like a function, but the parameters can actually return results. And best of all is that the parameters support EL, expression language, and that gives you some power. You can define, if you use the XML definition, you can define EL to pass in objects of a type. Yes, I'm missing one more thing. There's a brand new, what is it called, in the page view in Facelet. You've got this brand new property, implicit property in Facelets or page view called flow scope, which allows you to pass these parameters from one flow to another. In fact, that's the only way of getting information from one flow to another. So think back what I said, flows are protected. When you're outside of the flow, the actual JSF implementation will prevent you from going into the flow. And there's only one way into the flow at the beginning. And once you're in the flow, you can go to any page view that you define inside the flow, which is usually a folder. But then if you decide to leave the flow, at that point, then that flow will end. So you've got the ability to bundle up or design and build these little bits of energy functions to modularize your application.
Would you mind giving an example of, or perhaps another example of like a business use case where you might use that? Just like, what am I seeing on the screen?
Right, so flows are, they're very basic workflows. So let's see, a business example might be an e-commerce shopping cart. So you have a flow which is take me to the checkout, and one nested flow, you have two nested flows. So you have two nested flows. One is, what would it be? Your delivery address. The other might be payment. And you might have UX testing to say, right, how do I organize these things together? So you may have an encapsulate, you may already have some other IT department who has written a flow that does payments. So then all you then need to do is somehow integrate their flow and into your master flow so that you invoke, go into their service. Of course, you have to bundle and make sure your database and your POJOs and your Java stuff all link up together. So that's an example of it. So
you can kind of compose.
You can compose things. Yeah.
Especially design all yourself. Which is
yes, you can. Yeah. So that's the general idea. And then, yeah. So that's how it would work. Yes, so yeah, you can, as I said, then build your own flows. You can also package a flow in a jar file, and there's this handy thing called resource library contracts, which even allows you to style parts of your Faces applications. Yeah, and you need to use the flow scope to pass parameters between the flows, so you can't actually do it any other way. So a flow scope requires a POJO with a specific name called sector flow, sector-flow, and that's like the key identifier. Of course, it's got to be serializable again. And then it's just like any controller backending in JSF. You might want to, when a flow is initialized, because the first flow, the first navigation point is under the current implementation is actually just a directory name, which means you tend to be taken to a facelet view, a page view, which is index.xhtml or whatever you call your facelets. And so generally, that's when your backend bean is instantiated, and hence you want to intersect maybe. I want to, when I instantiate my backend bean of a property, I want to make sure it's got an application ID. So that's what's happening there. So when I inject the footprint service, this footprint is actually a POJO footprint data entity object, and I'm just initializing its application ID. This might be the beginning of a long process. So the actual idea is to enter energy data, your carbon footprint. So if you want to end the flow, you have to go you outside of the flow layout directory. So though it might seem confusing, it actually works out well. You have to tell JSF, I no longer want to be inside this flow, so exit with /, which makes me go to the root web app directory in my application and go to that specific page to end the flow. So this is what a flow definition looks like, and this will be in your flow layout directory / and it's actually has to have the same name as the flow. So if my flow was called simple flow, I would have to have an XML file called simpleflow.xml, and this would be my definition. So my flow definition there, ID, matches what I've called my POJO, and I have a couple of return points here. I can go home, that's a named target in the faces navigation, or I have another one called endflow, and which does the same thing. What actually happens there, notice I've got expression language here. I've got set to flow, and I'm invoking that method in the manage bean. So in my XML, I can have a little bit of expression language. We actually invokes this method here. I go to endflow, and what happens that outcome string is passed back to JSF to go and render this page. So the next powerful thing is that from the industry sector, I can invoke another flow which I call has an ID. This flow call has an ID called footprint flow, and it needs a reference to the actual nested ID, which is footprint flow, and I can pass in outbound parameters from the outside flow into the incoming flow. And the way it works is that you've got a name parameter, and I give the object that I want to pass and send through to the next flow as this expressing language here. So if this actually says send to the next flow what I have in my backing bean called sector flow, and it's actually the footprint data object record. And that could be anything you like. You can have as many outbound parameters as you like. So you can send in customer data, the actual objects to the next flow, and also get back. And because you're supplying data objects, you can actually change the contents of those entity objects. And that's how you actually return from data from one nested object to the outside nested flow. So if my outside nested flow was a list collection of widgets or empty shopping cart, my nested flow could actually populate that with the customer's stock information for all the products, and then report that back to the outside flow. And the outside flow could do something else in its workflow process, which is to actually check that those items are in the warehouse, for example, and could flag up, oh wow, sorry I won't be able to fulfill your order. I hope that kind of makes sense. So what the inside flow here, the nested flow does, in my carbon footprint example, here I'm showing that constructor, and there's my carbon footprint object. So what I'm doing here is actually saving myself a little bit of work. This is what this initializes. So I'm getting from faces context, the current context in this long set of accessors, the flow map, and I know what my parameter is from the XML, which is this param3 value, and then I'm actually populating the property in my backing beam. And this is purely for convenience, because what do your developers do? They want to write with their page view with actually the backing beam, which is footprint flow dot footprint dot thing. They don't actually want to write flow scope, square brackets, key value notation, param3. What the hell does param3 value mean? So that's a handy way of doing that. So that was faces flow. And this is brand new. This is not part of JavaEE 7, but I think this has nice potential. It's called Model View Controller 1. And you may be thinking, why have an MVC? Why standardize an MVC? What are these idiots doing in the JCP? But actually, I've come round. I was very much against it, JSR 371. But I've come round to thinking, yes, we probably do need some standard action-orientated request framework to help us with applications that are not suited for, I guess, faces. And there's lots of reasons why, lots of applications that are not suited for faces. The MVC is going to be a separate view layer rendered into JSF. So again, if you use MVC 1, you're not going to be relying on the life cycle to get you out of trouble with validation. It'd be bad like programming with structs or web work again. You'll have to take care of valuations yourself, validations yourself. I think they're going to support being validation. And then I looked at where they borrow their ideas from, which is Jersey MVC templates. And yeah, it's kind of a competitor to Spring MVC. But then I wondered, because if you look and work with JavaScript guys, they're always mucking about with these single page applications, which Faces is not quite suited for. So MVC will have a view layer, it will have a different rendering layer, it may have the faithlets templating may become its own standard. I think that was the plan. But there, of course, if you already know there's JSP out there, Java Server Pages, if you want to write dynamic content, there's that already, the view language. I'm not quite sure how the life cycle of these things will work. You probably still have request, application, scope and session. Well, who knows if you have any sort of flow scope or... But CDI will still be around. And where I think MVC has a sweet spot is I think it's a particularly good fit for AngularJS. These applications where you write a lot in JavaScript. And if you've worked with Angular, the examples are talking to a RESTful website that has, and of course, JavaEE has JAX-RS, but what it doesn't have is a way to actually turn those requests into page views or some sort of viewable, renderable view technology. And I think the footprint of, excuse the pun, with the examples is that it probably will be actually be part of the web profile, so be bundled with Undertow or Tomcat and things like that, as well as GlassFish Web. So this is the hypothetical MVC1 example. There will be some kind of controller. It looks very much like JAX-RS, if I say so myself, and I guess that's where it is. Ignore that. That is uncompilable.
It takes too much Scala.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so you've got a payments endpoint, a RESTful endpoint, and you've got a path and a path, which means there's actually URI is payments / accounts, and it's returning this viewable. And this is based on the Jersey example. And so this thing doesn't exist quite yet, and you can't actually use it at the moment, but it does sound very promising for those sorts of applications where you want to have JAX-RS and also have a kind of you want to have just one source for your kind of logic or interface. It sort of fits the microservices idea with Code Halle, and it's just a shame that the actual framework is still reliant on an old version of Jersey, which I wish it could be updated. That is basically almost the end of my presentation. So I will see if I can find IntelliJ.